Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Hong. I am the director of the Center for Racial Justice at UC Santa Cruz. And it is really my very great honor to welcome you to today's event. I gather that many of you were able to view the film, The Celine Archive, in advance. And today we have the enormous privilege and honor of being in conversation with the brilliant filmmaker behind that film, our very own arts dean at UC Santa Cruz, Celine Parreñas Shimizu. And I want to say too that my co-facilitator, Kylie McLaughlin, was supposed to be here today, but unfortunately has fallen sick. I want to also thank Chiza Hughes and Domingo Canizales for all of their labor in organizing today's event. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce Dean Shimizu. Celine Parreñas Shimizu is an extraordinarily, incredibly thoughtful, interesting, and risk-taking filmmaker and film scholar. As I mentioned, she is the Dean of Arts here at UC Santa Cruz, and I believe the first Dean of Color, if that's, no, that's not true. First woman Dean of Color. Got it, yeah. I shouldn't say that coming from my own division, but, and she's also a distinguished professor of film and digital media on this campus. She has written an extraordinary number of books. She wrote The Proximity of Other Skins, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2020, Straitjacket Sexualities, which came out through Stanford in 2012, The Hypersexuality of Race, and that was published by Duke in 2007. These are hugely influential works of scholarship within multiple fields. She also co-edited really deeply influential collections, The Feminist Porn Book in 2013, The Unwatchability of Whiteness in 2018. This film that we are going to be discussing, the Celine Archive, is 1 out of 6, and this is an extraordinary, truly incredible body of work, and this film has won several festival awards. She's currently at work at her next book, which is called The Movies of Racial Childhoods, which is forthcoming from Duke, and she's in post-production for a film 80 years later on Japanese American racial inheritance in the aftermath of World War II family incarceration. I also want to mention that, and I'm speaking as the chair of critical race and ethnic studies, I take great pride in the fact, in telling you that Celine got her BA in ethnic studies from UC Berkeley. And you can see in the chat, Chiza placed the link to Celine's website there. So you can check out that website for more information about the incredible work that Celine has done. And so I wanted, before we begin our conversation, Chiza was hoping to screen throughout the conversation a few clips from the film. And I was hoping that we could begin with one that it introduces the story of Celine Navarro. It offers a bit of the backstory to her murder. And after that, if you wouldn't mind speaking a bit about the film itself. And, I invite any of our attendees to place their questions in the Q&A. And you can also use the chat function throughout. We hope that this will be a very interactive discussion. So please make liberal use of both functions. Okay, Chiza, would you mind screening that?
Who was she? Celine to her family, and Celine in the headlines, from Singapore to London, Los Angeles, and New York. Sometimes they called her Cecilia. even Marcelina. They couldn't get her name right. Was she an adulteress, cheating on her dying husband, meeting punishment by kidnapping, stoning, crawling on beans, death? Was she a victim? A Caballeros de Mazalang leader preyed upon her. Her husband encouraged her to comply. A spurned wife slaps her in the face.
Celine Navarro was accused of committing adultery on her sick husband, but it's very difficult to disentangle that accusation from the larger kind of backstory of her calling the police and testifying against members of the Caballeros.
Celine Navarro is part of the Maria Clara Lodge. She witnesses several of her lodge brothers harassing a man who had helped a white woman escape from an abusive marriage from another lodge brother. And she testifies against her lodge brothers to the police. And I really believe that this is kind of central, to understanding why her status in the lodge really falls. Because secrecy is paramount in all of these different kinds of Filipino nationalist organizations.
So this is a
So, Celine, in the film, you also speak about coming across archival mentions of this story. And, I think that it's very interesting that these archival mentions and the language is so sensationalist. It's voodoo cult, it is voodoo grave, the term weird, buried alive. I mean, it's like tabloid news almost before its time in a way. And, Dorothy Cordova states at one point that what you get is you get these mediated accounts, but you don't get the sort of, it's hard to, sweep aside that thicket of sensationalism. And so could you just speak, could you speak about this story, its resonance for you? What was so compelling to you about it?
Thank you so much, Christine. It's home, ethnic studies. Mm. So of course our discussions here, are super informed and, are very aware of the way in which Filipino Americans, Filipinx Americans are really disparaged, ignored. The default is really just subordinated in history. And so, I look at those images of myself at the archive because I think I was really trying to capture what it means to look at a thing that is so important to me personally, but as you say, is so maligned in this, larger representation that we don't control, but has so much power in classifying a group. And then there's the community history of it, where, Don Mabalon, the late great Don Mabalon, Rick Baldos, the sociologist of immigration, we're bound by this story. This story has existed and we're found by each of us, across decades, but never really felt, I think, comfortable talking about it. I think Dawn had it in her pocket for decades before really talking about it because it felt quite risky, the affirmation of, the pervertization, the perversion, of Filipinx people, because they were not supposed to qualify for citizenship at the time, that this event happened in 1932, 1933. It's right before the Tidings-McDuffie Act, the status of Filipino Americans were really being debated. Do they belong here at this time of Asian exclusion? Celine Navarro was able to move back and forth between the Philippines and the United States as if it was a subway, and Asians, were not really allowed to move in that way, So there's something really revealing about, this story, in terms of the time in which this film could be made, in the resulting from, Me Too and Time's Up, that there was a way in which the community was finally able to talk about it. And it was really important for me to bring those people in to tell a community history together,
Yeah, it's the story is to some degree, without question, about Celine Navarro, but it is profoundly a story about grief. And maybe it's not even a story about grief, it's almost a ritual of grieving. And, I was incredibly moved by the kind of affective space that you declared in this film, that you declared as in you made space for, you held space for. And it's so striking to me. And, you interweave the story of the loss of your son. And it's very striking to me too, as someone who has experienced a lot of loss, how, and this sounds like a gross overgeneralization, but that this society, and maybe it is capitalist society, and maybe it is post-immigration society, like there isn't the same kind of space that is held open for grieving. And you state, so I feel sometimes as though grief is an anti-capitalist emotion, but you state that you externalized the suffering to reduce the hurt. And there's something about that holds true for you, and that also holds true for the family of Celine Navarro. And so there's multiple generations that you are speaking to in terms of the family and her family. And excavating the story, it's almost like the kind of sensationalist account of the story invisibilizes more than it ever discloses, right? And but the excavation enables a kind of grief. And so you have someone like Henny Navarro, the grandson, who describes himself as a tough guy, in the Philippines, speaking about his grandmother coming to him in a dream, and tears, are coming to his eyes. And, it also, and then you also have the closing scene of a funeral, so there's ritual dimensions to this. And it's not this sort of cult ritual, it's a ritual that honors the life that was lived and honors the loss. And, it's so interesting to see that young boy. I don't know what his relationship was to Celine, but going there and weeping, actually, and to realize that for someone who was too young to have ever known, like there's no direct knowledge, but the grief is transmitted, generationally. And it reminded me too a bit, there's a line in Heinz Insu Finkel's Memories of My Ghost Brother, where he speaks about this one, the narrator speaks about a cousin, a woman who was, who died. And she didn't have a lineage per se, but she also died in dishonor, right? She died in dishonor. And so her grave was allowed to sort of erode. No one knew where it was. And he said, his line is, hers was not an ancestral grave, like the unmarked grave that is lost to the lineage that cannot, that isn't automatically, sort of honored, that the life is not honored. So I was wondering if you could speak about this film as an act of grieving.
We are all living in this intense time of loss, where so many, young people, have lost members of their family. I myself lost an entire generation, of on my like my mom and her siblings, like so many people died. And I was so afraid when the pandemic started that children were going to die, because there's something just so unnatural about that disorder of things. And for me, when my son died, it was quite sudden. It was like within 24 hours, and it was Christmas Day. And how can someone disappear? How can someone just lose their body and just not be around you, especially when you're raising someone who needs you? And I think for me, I didn't realize like how much I needed him, to live. So I think maybe for 6 months after he died, I couldn't read, I couldn't write, which is like our work, I remember just really trying, just looking at a computer and just think, I don't know what happened. I wasn't able to do it. And somehow, this film is an act of creativity because I realized that I was alive and I didn't want to be. Like people would come up to me and say, "Are you okay? Are you gonna die?" And I think I felt that. I felt like his death could have led to my death because it's so painful, And so this film, I had to go to the family. I had to go to Celine Navarro's family and ask them about it. And I found a real kinship with them, because her death, I think, was so brutal, and it's an ongoing multi-generational pain, that they're feeling like it happened yesterday, like when I was interviewing her daughter, I couldn't believe I found her daughter, and I was walking into her Chicago apartment, walking in the hallway, and she was jumping up and down like a 4-year-old, and she's, in her early 90s. And I just couldn't believe like I was touching someone who was related to Celine Navarro, this woman who I'd been living with for, more than 20 years, that she was this mother and, this daughter who was really orphaned, like when you ask her, what was your childhood like? She just bursts out crying because it was so rough not having this mother, not having someone who was going to give you confidence and nurturing and care, not celebrating your birthdays, all of that, so that brutality of just sudden death and unexpected death, and the real consequences of that. So to me, it was a real act of creativity, even, so grief as an act of creativity, or grief that ignites or spurs creativity, because it's really a way to forge a new life, and the funeral at the end, which gathered, multiple generations of her descendants. She has like over 124, descendants, and, they're Black, they're Latinx, they're Filipinx, they look like California, and they had not had one at that scale. And that boy at the end is Henny's grandson, and he was, I think, 8 at the time. And, he was my son's age at that time. And like that capacity to feel, was there and was not, prompted, like he went on his own by himself. And then his mom had to walk up to him, and the little girl was looking at them. Documentary is just amazing, right? Like, you can't make it up. It's the way the mom was so caring to the son as he was just so vulnerable, and the way the girl cared so much about her mother not falling apart, and her brother as well. It's not the kind of thing where you go to like your cinematographer and say, "Oh, we got the movie," like this happened. But, as a director, I think what happened right before that scene, because you have very little time to shoot. And so, my pain is so raw and it's right there. And I think I was able to ask them to remember what it felt, to not have her. Because, they have this tendency to live really long lives. Her sisters lived until, I don't know, like late 80s, early 90s. Like they would have had their grandma, because the sisters all hung out, And so I think I directed them for 2 minutes, and then that's what happened, And, you know, I think it's the greatest honor to be adopted by the film subjects.
Yeah.
You know, like they, you know, we text each other all the time and
Yeah.
all of that, you know, we're very, very connected. And because I think it was very clear that I never wanted to harm them, and they knew where I was coming from in terms of just making sense of, you know, how do they remember her, especially because she's so spoken for, you know, by the newspapers, et cetera.
I mean, it's an extraordinarily tender film, and the rawness is palpable, and you know, it's yeah, you know, it's there is a question too in the chat that relates to this, and the question is posed. Where and how do you even begin to document such a delicate space? And what was your approach? Did you have a sort of preset idea of how you would approach the experiences of the family members during production? You know, so did you have like a sense of sort of working guidelines in coming into this terrain, you know, that was, like you said, you know, where Celine Navarro was so spoken for, and the discourse around Celine Navarro was itself such a form of violence?
You know, when you're preparing to shoot a documentary, it took a long time, you know, and to gain the trust of the family. And I first got connected to the family in 2012 when I was giving a talk at the Echo Park Public Library in Los Angeles. And someone in the audience, there were 200 people in the audience, asked, it was pretty great doing a kind of a public talk like that in a city, you know, with different generations of people, different levels of education, but, you know, people who attend the library. And someone asked me, what's your next film about? And I said, I've been working on this film, you know, for a long time. And they approached me at the end and said, I know the family. And then we met at like an Olive Garden in Southern California and just immediately established, you know, that link. Celine Navarro's youngest sister was still alive in 2012. And so it was taking a long time just talking with each other. And then Lacoste died, and then she died. And then I think 6 months after that, we got together again. And then, you know, I talked with them on the phone weekly for months, just talking to them about what I had been finding. I mean, they were just so hungry, you know, because this is all oral history passed down. So for them to meet someone who has studied the archive for decades, essentially. I mean, I was around that archive for 20 years, but studied it more intensely for 4 years at the Bancroft and just copied everything. So I just knew so much that they wanted to ask about and wanted to hear more about, because it was becoming real versus something that they just passed on that was so incredibly unbelievable. And I remember then being introduced to Henny, who I talked to on the phone, like he was my phone pal for months. And then finally his wife was like, who is this woman you're talking to on the phone? She could be a totally crazy person. And so we met at a Chinese restaurant, and we brought my director of photography, you know, who's just the most respectful, most charming, humble person. And after that, we knew what we needed to do, you know, in terms of Brandon Victoriano's question in the Q&A. We knew that we wanted to take Henny to the place where she was killed. And because scholars would go there and hang out there, like Jean Vangua, Alex Frabos, they would go there. I would go there. Why are we going there? You know, I think we need to do the work of making it a historical landmark, but we would go there as a site of Filipino American history, specifically the history of women that's been buried. We would go there. You know, like Alex Frabos would hang out there and write. Jean Vangua wrote her epic poem there, and I would just go there. Why? I don't know, because it was a disappearing place. When you go there, it is like the site of like these McMansions starting to build up, like houses that are really close to each other. So it's probably going to disappear in 20 years, you know, because everyone's vacating the Bay Area, you know. And the first time I went there was so eerie. I was still at that phase where I really thought that my approach cinematically was going to be like, you know, linking it to Filipino aswang, like Filipino ghosts are so gruesome, you know. And I thought, you know, there's a specific ghost that I was really thinking a lot about. Like my sisters would buy me paintings of this particular ghost because I was so obsessed with this ghost, because I thought of Celine Navarro as a ghost, you know, as someone I think who would harm you. I mean, I thought that because this ghost, eats babies, like sucks livers out of babies and flies around at night. And so they would help me to create the cinematic language. I was interviewing animators. I thought I was going to create this ghost linking the Philippines and Filipino America. But as soon as I met the family, it moved away from that. The ghost was kind of this insulting, trivializing figure, and I ran away from it. And going to the site, I wanted to bring the family to the site where she was buried, after talking with him, knowing that he's the one who marked the grave, and then to create a funeral, because I found out what a funeral is about, because I had to put together a funeral, so I wanted to give them that funeral, because there's something that happens in that ceremony, So I hope I answered Brandon's question. I also knew that I had to go to Chicago to meet in the home of Celine Navarro. And then I also had to go and show the archive, Filipino American National Historical Society, and to honor the work of Fred and Dorothy Cordova.
Yes, yes.
Like, Filipinos are so unloved in our society, and all of what they do is such an act of love, of giving reverence, importance, respect, admiration. That's what they're doing there. And I wanted, to show all of that and to honor those efforts, not just as a scholarly effort, but as a community building, community affirmation, effort.
And that is an extraordinary thing, because you brought Celine's, daughter and granddaughter in conversation with Dorothy Cordova. So it's this reception on the part of the community, Fred and Dorothy being the major community archivists. And then also, with regard to Alex Fabros, there is this sense of this community historians who are also embracing, Don Mabron, there's this sort of embrace, that is so extraordinary too. And that's just another aspect of your film that struck me as so tender. Mm-hmm. And, I was wondering, Chiza, would you mind screening the clip about some of the archival materials? It seems like this is, so if we could reorder it back to the way that you had it originally. Thank you.
Yeah, my granduncle was a Dimasalang.
He was in the Dimasalang too?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Since Hawaii.
But did you know about what happened?
Just the stories that you're told. But you know what? They're not going to tell that story.
They're not going to tell that story.
No, they're not going to tell that story. Even though we're family, you're not a bro. You're not a lodge member.
Right.
Hush.
Yeah.
Stuff is quiet. Yeah, punishment. That's hard. Punishment is. This was final.
That's right. Beyond punishment.
Yeah, right.
It's like the ceremonial stuff.
Yes, right. Okay, some more of that too.
Giving people permission to move. Like, that's interesting, right? It isn't just like, hey, I'm moving, but will you let me move?
Yeah, why?
Why do you need permission?
Why did he even need to ask anyone? But it meant a lot. It meant that,
Oh, you know why? It's because they're going to give them money to move. They help people move. Like, it's what you say about, like, providing support.
That was their support system. Without that, they couldn't exist. At that time of the Depression, they depended on each other for everything. Pool their resources, their living, their food.
It's amazing they're so formal. I mean, it makes sense that they're so formal.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
It does. Oh, that one looks tight.
It does look tight.
That one looks tight. Oh, okay.
It's interesting. Bubuksan, which means opening. If you open yourself, I mean, this is like super deep Tagalog, actually. You are now here in the hands of people you don't know, and you don't know what will happen to you. I mean, they use the word alipin, which means slavery.
Yeah.
And then kalayaan, of course, which means freedom. We as slaves have no freedom. It's intense. We will wash you with water.
Almost like a baptismal, huh?
This is initiation, yeah. So initiation and baptism.
It has a religious connotation to it.
Yeah, look at this. It's like we will eliminate like the dirt from you. You will no longer be dirty. And now you are brand new.
Pretty amazing. Amazing.
And look how ceremonial it is. You are now ready. Nakahanda kayong manumpa. You are now ready to be here in front of us. Where did that come from? It
was back here.
Wow.
Okay.
You okay? Can I help you here?
Yeah. Go ahead and grab that side, please. And we'll take this out and see if we can open it.
Okay.
So. Go ahead and have a look, see.
What the hell? What the hell? Oh. And then here is, it's the Bible. And then here's like the justice. God, like the contradiction, right? Like the symbolism of like justice, you know, is so strong.
What does it mean across generations to live with a legacy of your ancestors' violent death, to be sacrificed by an entire community? I cannot imagine the pain I feel for Celine's family as a grieving mom. My son Lacoste was not sick. A common virus attacked his heart, and within 24 hours, he died. A rare catastrophe. I am barely alive. I externalize the suffering to reduce the thickness of the hurt. Yoga enables me to commune with Lacoste. Imagine him then and his dimensionality now. What he would say, how he would move, the expressions of his face, his weight on my lap, his powerful embrace. I want to give Celine's family her facets, the thick dimensionality of her story.
Celine, your film is so powerful that I feel as though it's all we can do just to breathe after watching what we just did. Yeah. You know, you speak about the thick dimensionality of Celine Navarro's story. And the thick dimensionality doesn't necessarily reside in the facts. So it's not that kind of investigation. So could you speak about this? And then related to that, I want to ask you about your archival practice, but how do you understand thick dimensionality relative to this story?
Well, Dawn Mabalan, has so much detail in her own book, Little Manila is in the Heart, about how Celine Navarro was a very popular babysitter in the community. So what does it mean for this, woman who has 4 kids herself and is a doting, community member to the kids? Like the kids gravitated towards her. So like it's not common, for a figure like that. It's distinctive. It's she has a personality, that I think does not come through in the articles, where I think she was really more represented as a kind of wanton woman. There was, these claims that she was an adulteress, and within the context of, the 14-to-1 ratio of men and women, and the kind of, just gallant, valiant, very fashionable looking, like Filipino men in all of the archives, wearing this like denim and bandanas, and they were so homosocial, homoerotic, in the way that they touched each other. And then the women were so on the side. So if we have this representation of this very, sexually, valiant, men who are viable partners, and then the women were invisible. And then suddenly there's this woman who has this reputation of being an adulteress. It kind of conjures up these images of a woman who was, coming to the US and really running with her own sexual agency, like taking her pick, maybe she wasn't happy with her husband, so she was getting together with someone else. So that was kind of the story that kind of undergirded, all of these, descriptions of her as an adulteress, who stole money from her husband who was sick, and then, the names of the men. Like I started imagining, was she, having an affair with Bustamante, the foreman, the guy who ended up, coming forward on April 1, 1933, saying we buried a body, because he thought he was next, because people were just falling apart after committing such a, horrible crime, right? And so there, I think that was the most prominent story about her, was that she was this, woman with sexual agency, taking her pick, and then the story that's most prominent among the scholars is that she was this, kind of pioneering feminist heroine who had the courage and the bravery to come forward and become disloyal to the community who was really under siege, and to betray them in order to achieve, gendered, justice, and to really expose the domestic violence that was happening in the community, And then one of the narratives too that was, propagated by the sisters is that she was being preyed upon by a very powerful member of the community. So rather than a woman with sexual freedom, she was a woman who was disciplined sexually and who was very afraid. According to her sisters, she was this very timid, scaredy cat, shy girl. So
like
very
a mouse.
Yeah,
right?
Like a mouse, like very different from that wanton woman who was like this sexually brazen, person. So, that's what I meant about the thick dimensionality, like the multifaceted, versions of her that come from the people who studied her, rather than, journalists who wanted to render this community as savage, primitive, not deserving to be here, and that they were creating their own, justice system, which is why they were so segregated, like just really justifying the virulent racism that they were experiencing at the time. And, all of this was happening in our very area, in the 831, the 408,
yes,
the Stockton area, the bombings, the killings of Filipino Americans here in Watsonville, where this, gang of 500 white men were going around, burning the makeshift homes of Filipino Americans, there could be more Filipino food available to us right now, except, you know, that they were really run off from this community, you know?
You know, it's striking because there's so many different forms, you know, like Jacqueline Goldsby, who writes about lynching, also writes about the fact that lynching was equal opportunity in its violence. And so you see also, like, you know, with regard to migrant workers, lynchings, you see the driving outs of, you know, in an earlier era of Chinese migrant workers. And this is, you know, like especially in an earlier era, it's also the time when, you know, California state officials, and Newsom has acknowledged this, perpetrated genocide against indigenous peoples, you know, within this area. And, but there's something, when you talk about the thick dimensionality, you were talking about, there are different accounts, and there's a kind of feminist retrieval. At the same time, you speak about a community that's been so marginalized, and the engine of that marginalization is colonialism. So like the question of how do you have a kind of, and you know, you have people within the community saying to these outside reporters, this is our justice, at a time when Carlos Bulosan was saying to be Filipino in the, you know, in America was to be a criminal, you know, so, you know, you have these multiple layers. So how you would approach this from a, you know, decolonial perspective is hard to say, because it is so infinitely layered. And there's also the sisters, you know, speaking about the husband too, like, you know, our sister was wearing the same clothes, you know, like noticing those details. It's in those details that a certain dimensionality comes out too. And it's not as though all of the details add up to a coherent image, but maybe that's just the complexity of life. You know what I mean? You know, but I wanted to ask a question, and this is from Kylie McLaughlin, who, you know, wanted to be able to join us. And, you know, in Kylie's course that she is teaching this quarter, and there are some people here who are from Kylie's, some students who are from Kylie's class, you know, they read Gina Velasco's Queering the Global Filipina Body. And, you know, in that work, she puts forward this loving critique of heteropatriarchal nationalism within the, you know, Filipino American diaspora. And, you know, we'll get to this maybe in just a moment, you know, with, you know, when Don, you know, Mabolon says the story that we tell, you know, of Filipinos in America is one of men, of the Manongs, right? But she says you can find women's voices in the archives of people's homes. So striking how it's within critical Filipino studies that there is such an interesting critique of the archives. You know, Martin Manalanson, you know, and, you know, also here, you know, you have this critique, this interesting tussling with what is the archive. And so the question that Kylie has is, you know, like, for example, the Watson Villas in the Heart Project also relies upon necessarily intergenerational transmission within sort of heteronuclear family structures for access to and preservation of family materials. If the home is a repository, it requires that kind of social structure. So the question that Kylie poses is, how do you, or do you, see kinship structuring the archive? And how do you see heteropatriarchy and the privileging of the heteronuclear family as structuring what we call the archive and scholarship, you know, that is based upon a retrieval of those materials? And are there other kinds of structures and models we can look to? How did you animate that in your own approach to the archive? And this is profoundly a tale of disrupted kinship, of a family that was scattered by this very violent act. And so what were the challenges of having to follow the rumors and the hearsay, the ghost stories? And how did you treat these sources as sources? What was your methodology? How did you address gaps in the archive?
Thank you. It's so great to hear Gina Velasco's name, graduate of our renowned History of Consciousness program, doing really incredible work. I think she's moving to Haverford College to direct gender and women's studies there. So, I wanted to make sure that I talked with the family and I talked with community historians, and they really were the pioneers in terms of exposing the story in Filipinas magazine in 1997. It wasn't in any scholarly book or article, even though people had known about it for decades before 1997. It's interesting that Alex Babros published it to great wrath in the community. People were not into it that he did this. The family was so grateful. I mean, they photocopied it and just passed it around. They're sacred documents within the family, because finally, the story was being validated. But I don't want to render, the scholarly perspectives on this as homogenous, because there's definitely questions and contests between them. My sister, Celine Parreñas, the sociologist with whom I collaborated on this film, because she's such an extraordinary, ethnographer and interviewer. And it was just such a pleasure to do this work together. And, she said, why are we heroizing a victim? Why are we heroizing a victim? And this was a question, that we posed, and, Don Mabalan has, I think it comes down more strongly to really celebrating her as a feminist pioneer. And I think so does Rick Baldos, who wants to lionize her and say she belongs, like in all those t-shirts that say Carlos Bulosan, like you have to have Celine Navarro in there too. But what's the story? I mean, there's so many competing narratives that we don't quite know. The family is so revolted by, the assertion that she was this adulteress. They don't want that at all. And I think, it is part of that, romanticizing, heteropatriarchal culture, but they wanted her to have dignity. That's what they wanted. So I wanted to make sure that those competing, narratives were there. But one thing that I did not want to do was to, really talk with the people who were indicted as her killers. I did not want to do like this, what some people consider like a shortcoming of the film. Oh, there isn't enough truth and reconciliation. There needed to be like the coming together of the people who killed her and her family. And I thought, I will not do that kind of violence onto this family. That is not where I am aligned. And I will protect, Celine Navarro's family from that, So I think, part of that demand, part of that critique is very much this, unification of a community that continues to silence women.
It's interesting in your filmmaking, though, because there's a moment in which there's a voiceover, and it's Dorothy Cordova speaking, and she states, there was a man who wanted her and she wouldn't give in to him. And
yeah.
You do something very interesting visually. You want to speak about that?
I don't remember what it is. Yeah, sure. I don't remember what it is.
You show an image of Leon Quintanilla.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I did, yeah.
And you don't say anything, but you show the image there.
And say his name.
Mm-hmm.
And, we consulted, with legal counsel about that,
Yeah.
just to make sure it's all good, but that's what was in the archives.
Yeah. Right. There's
and his
also
photo was in the archive, with his name, someone who was doing that to her.
Right. Yeah. I appreciated that kind of deft storytelling, that interwoven storytelling style. So Chiza has a question in the chat, which is, could you talk about how you thought through relaying the information that you uncovered as a filmmaker? What were your strategies to honor the nuance of the dimensions of the race, gender, cultural diaspora in the story? What were the your particular challenges?
When you're making a film, you're deep in it. And I mean, I talk to people about it, as I'm making it. And I think I especially talk with older people, really thinking as an historian, and of course, reading as much as I can about that particular era to see that I'm not just transferring, concepts that didn't exist at certain times, But one thing that was very important to me was not to misrepresent the intensity of the racism, that the Filipino people were experiencing in terms of, segregation and not really have access to infrastructure, like where do you go to buy food, or not expect to be protected by the police, but instead, we're disciplined by them, So it was very important to really stay close to the historical context and never let go of the intensity of the segregation and the racism, and what Bulasan says about the criminality that were attributed to Filipino people at the time. And so as to really show that thrust is still here today in our capacity not to include women in stories, because for me it was so frustrating in ethnic studies at the time. Even Ron Takaki's book, like they with the Strangers from a Different Shore, they really celebrated like, oh, you think Asian American men are asexual, effeminate, and all these things, but look at Filipinos. They got around. Everybody wanted them. They were sexual conquerors, as if that is the kind of masculinity we should go for, right? And so, but at the same time, like, sharing the story of Celine Navarro had to really occur within that context. Like that context, could not disappear. And then the second thing is, in terms of the cultural diaspora, the challenges there, like where did the fraternal organizations come from? There were three main fraternal organizations at the time, of which Caballeros de Masalang was a part. And, they really started out in the Philippines, but they became something else here because, Filipinos at the time, 30 to 40,000 were suddenly here, within that past 10, 15 years. And they were mostly young people. No one was over 30, they were like 15 to 30, so people were, coming up with their own cultural organizations. They had to figure out a way to get married, a way to bury each other, a way to feed each other, find housing for each other. And so I couldn't really get into it. And I hope that the film is an invitation, for other people to just delve more deeply into it, and to know that there's just so much to be done. I mean, it's interesting to think about popular culture and, the Black Eyed Peas with their Bebot #1, Bebot #2 videos, because in some ways that gives you a kind of glimpse into what a narrative version of this film could look like, But of course, it's kind of like a hip hop dancing video, but it was very much inspired by the taxi dance halls of the time, where people are in stoop labor all day, but just getting down at night, dancing.
Right. It's, the stoop labor. What was his name? Kerry McWilliams, was
Yes.
that? Yeah, Kerry McWilliams, and his description of stoop labor as being racializing, and the fact that, that to cut asparagus, right? He says you need an army of men, but what you don't need is women and children. And so, like, that's what he said. So he said that, like the sort of, you can see how racial capitalism produces certain kinds of demographics of surplus populations, and according to the nature of the industry that people are sort of drawn into, So there's some questions that Kylie's students had posed. And so one of the questions was what the reception has been like specifically among people within the diaspora, and if there have been any residual pockets of this story should have stayed buried.
I haven't really gotten that kind of pushback about making this film and further burying it, or burying things that I raised. There's a lot of curiosity from audiences in the Philippines. I don't know how they saw it. Oh no, it's because of there were a couple of festivals that were international, so they were able to see it online. There was just such a lot of curiosity about how it revealed, just the colonial relationship where there was a lack of power, to protect, Filipino subjects and citizens, in the US at the time. So there was a lot of interest more in understanding that historical moment, so I think that was, the most popular or the strongest feedback that I received was just more of this expression of curiosity about their marginalization at the time as a way to measure the lack of power of the Philippines and the continuing colonial relationship.
Mm-hmm. I have to say, I'm just going back to a point that you made earlier. Like there's different kinds of historiographical tendencies. So there's like the contemporaneous, like news clippings, which are very sensationalizing and particularly with regard to, Filipinos, like as a sort of, like savage cult and, like that sort of thing. And then there's a kind of demonization there that is sort of writ large. And then there are those community historians, whom you mentioned, who are heroizing, as you said, like there's a valorization of Celine Navarro to sort of pluck Celine out of the muck of the sort of former, accounts. But then there's also, and you're saying that your sister was saying, why this heroization? And, oftentimes, this film honors Celine, but it doesn't honor her by subscribing to a gendered notion of honor. You know what I mean? And that complexity is part of the honoring. There's a courage in that too, and not actually not leaving things open in a way, leaving things open. Yeah.
In her family, I think, have a huge part in what needs to be heroized, maybe, because they're holding on to her story as an inheritance, that they must grapple with,
Yeah.
I'm so interested in, her descendants, because I want them to make something out of it, for themselves, but beyond them, it's also our story, as a community, as people who are interested in Filipinos and people who are adjacent to it,
Chiza, would you mind playing the next clip?
The story that we tell of Filipino America of men. And there's a lot to tell. There's a lot of labor, there's a lot of migration. There is a farm workers movement, really, that is born in the 1920s with Filipino men and homosocial bonds that are created with Filipino men and communities and kind of its bachelor society. At the same time, you can find women's voices throughout the archives in people's homes, in their letters, in the Filipino American ethnic newspapers, of which there were dozens. And women write articles or they write letters to the editor. I was fortunate in being able to look at the Filipino American National Historical Society archives, where there are dozens of interviews of Filipino women. Dr. Dorothy Cordova was really a pioneer. She was born in Seattle in the 1930s. So she was really a pioneer in saying, look, Filipino women have a history. Cecilia, the 1920 census actually finds her in 2 different places, which tells us a lot about how Filipino families moved. At one point, the census enumerator found her and her husband living in Los Angeles. And then a few months later, they were living right outside of Stockton in an old township that doesn't exist anymore called O'Neill. She was only 15 years old in the 1920 census, and it was very common for young Filipinas, because of the sex ratio imbalance, to be married very young. Her mother was in the census as only 31 years old, so her mother must have had her at 15 or 16.
Celine apparently brings their 4 children back to the Philippines. Her husband has tuberculosis, and she returns. Something happens that makes her go down to California to be with her sisters. And this is the story that they tell when she's there. That's when she tells them what was happening in her life, that there was this man who wanted her, and she wouldn't give in to him, and that's why she came down. They described their sister as a shy, scaredy cat girl. Celine goes down there and confides to her sisters that there must be something happening. And by the time they put her back on the bus to return up north, she dies in a few days.
I think the larger community, might have stepped in and done something. I mean, there are second-generation Filipinos who say, she was my babysitter. She was a sweet woman. She was a kind woman. So I feel like our community could have been more loyal to her. It's a tragedy that this vow to secrecy could have been taken so far, whether it was this personal vendetta that people had against her, or a spurned lover, or it really was payback. Snitches end up in ditches.
Celine Navarro took a big risk. She saw a violent incident occur, and she knew that the people committing the incident were violent people themselves and had committed domestic violence against someone she knew, and she took action, and she paid, for that courage. She should be part of the kind of hero's narrative of Filipino Americans, whether Carlos Bulosan or Jose Rizal. I think Celine Navarro needs to be part of that story as well, as someone who engaged in a very courageous act and knew that there would be consequences and did it anyways.
I feel that Celine Navarro, she has been waiting for many decades for us to ask questions about her. I feel that as a historian, I tell my students, what I do is have a conversation with the ancestors. And whatever they leave behind, their letters, their notes, their court records, their newspaper stories, that's how they talk to us. And it's really up to us to figure out how to understand what they've left behind for us. And I feel that we've scratched the surface of what has happened to her, what happened to her. I think understanding more of that will help us to understand who we are as Filipino Americans, what kinds of communities we create, what kinds of families we've created, who women are and were becoming in the Filipino American community. What did it mean to be a woman? How did it change? What was women's power at this time? Because all of that helps us to understand who we are today.
Was she a traitor? She betrays the vow of secrecy to her beleaguered community, testifying against them, bearing witness to a crime. Was she a heroine? Her testimony helps to send men to prison. They had attacked another man who was helping a young white woman flee violence domestic abuse. Was she a scaredy cat? This is what her sisters called her.
So in that clip, it begins with the assertion that the story of Filipinos in America has historically focused on men. And, in another part of the film, Dorothy Cordova says that this wasn't an everyday occurrence. This is not, this is implying that this is the exception, not the rule. But I'm wondering if this is, if it can be generalized beyond the individual instance. And if so, is this a story about Filipinos in America that is a story about women? Like, are there larger, are there insights that you would draw from this that can be extrapolated beyond what might appear to be the exception?
Mm-hmm.
And what are those?
Well, a main one, I think, is this, assumption, that we live with in Asian American studies or in ethnic studies, where men migrated and women followed, But in this instance, Celine Navarro came with her widowed mother and, two of her sisters, and they came on their own, and, they came as laborers and had their own dreams, had their own goals, so that's one myth, that this film really explodes, is that story of a female past, and, and I think just the way in which, the status of Filipino citizenship and within, migration in the context of Asian Exclusion Acts. I think also you can trace all of their construction, through the experience of this one family, like the kids were dropped off right before she died and they couldn't come back until the Exclusion Acts were lifted. So they couldn't come back till after 1965. And only then, did they realize the whispers were really true about what had happened, to their mother. So I think those are two of the, main contributions, in the film. And, I didn't set out to make the film to make those contributions, but we discovered them, along the way when we were interrogating, the footage that we had. I think we had over 50 hours of footage, which ended up, just over an hour. So there's just so much more, that we were able to, get out of the experience, of being with all of these different sources. But those are, I think, two of the main contributions, that the film makes.
And what do you do with all the remaining footage? Because in making a film called the Celine Archive, you created a Celine Archive.
Yes. And it's interesting, right? Because I just finished this film on Japanese American internment where the footage, the archival materials are just so much more easy to find. There's just so much more of them. But in the case of the Filipino American Archive, it just was a lot harder to find it. And it's so interesting because I think about, if this were a narrative film, there was one particular guy who really was a very prominent person in our archival research, and his name is James Earl Woods, and he has 4 boxes at the Bancroft Library. And he was just obsessed with Filipinos. Like, he would take the train all over California, talk to the people who worked in hotels, talk to the people who worked in, migrant farm workers, talk to the people who were on the trains, and just created this huge archive. So if it would be a narrative film in Hollywood, it would be this white guy, like following Filipinos around, and it wouldn't be the Filipinos themselves, But I think what happens to the archive is, we just have to let it go and it becomes, something else, the film, as a director, like, my role is to make sure everybody gives their best. And I had such an extraordinary collaboration, with the composer. The sound design is so great in this film too. And, the editing as well. Even just the trailers, you're crying after 1 minute, And so, all of that just goes away. I think I have the transcripts, and I have just boxes and boxes of archival materials. So I can, give them away, eventually, but, it's 10 years,
Yeah.
of just collecting materials from the Bancroft, the Library of Congress, and more, And it was actually just super expensive to make this. And this is one of the legacies of Dawn Mabalon, like she was so great because she taught Filipino American National Historical Society to charge everybody for every single picture you use. So every single picture I used from them cost like $50, and then using all of the, it cost a lot of money just to get all of it. And it's one of the, best things about this film is that it's in one place, like all of the articles, just so many of the articles and the headlines are in one place, and and I think I have these giant posters of all of them, just all of the headlines scattered. And it really does paint this picture of this perversion of this community, when you look at just the keywords from the archives. Yeah.
I mean, of course, there's different trajectories. Like, one possible repository would be the family if they wanted it, but then they would have to do something with it. You know what I mean? Like, it's archives dissipate in family. You know what I mean? So, there's just different possibilities like that too.
Yeah, they have. I mean, it's almost like they were waiting for someone to come and help and help put this all together because they saved all their pictures. The families. I mean, there's so many pictures of Celine Navarro from their family.
Yes. Yeah.
And they have a private Facebook page where whenever they find it, it's just shared. So they're paying attention to the future and making sure it doesn't disappear.
So I wanted to invite people to put questions in. We have some questions in the Q&A, to put questions in the chat as well. And I think that one of them was basically already answered, but another one is about, in a way, it sort of echoes the first question, but it's noting the enormity of the emotional labor that you placed into the film and the connections that you make about trauma, loss, as well as presence. And, it's, it's a question. How do you go about navigating the intensity of the emotions? It reminds me of the first question about how do you navigate a sensitive area,
I think the only way that, people like me who have experienced, the death of a child to be able to live is to make sure there's a space in this life that we live to be able to talk about that death, to be able to talk about him and that experience. And, I feel, there's nothing good that comes out of his death because he should be alive, and I could continue just to ruminate, like, what happened? What did he touch? What did he eat? But I can't answer any of those questions except that I have to be able, to talk about him and whenever, and it's every day, it's like a never ending, just feeling of loss and pain that's unbearable, but you live with it. And what makes it bearable is to be able to talk about him and to experience those emotions, Otherwise, I think I would not be able to continue living, and in some ways, I think about that a lot being a dean, like as a dean and being responsible, for, the quality of the education, in my division, for example. I think it gives me this very sharp focus, which is, I know that all of us in this world will eventually feel a terrible loss, the inevitability of death that we will all experience, of a loved one. And I hope that what I can do is to strengthen everyone in the division in order to confront that with the strength of their craft, with the power of their intellect, that can all be sharpened here in order to be able to survive that pain, Because for me, I think, so many people came up to me and said, you are basically going to waste away from the death and you will no longer be a productive person. You will just, I know someone, it's my aunt, her kid died and she just shriveled away and became a nothing person. People would say this to me, and I actually find that every time I'm able to produce something like this film, I just feel so privileged to be alive and to make use of my life in this service, of making this work. And so I think it really guides my leadership, it guides, the way I live and the way I value the opportunity of being able to make things.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something about what you're saying, and you mentioned this before too. I mean, this is the kind of joint between the loss, of Celine Navarro and the loss of your son. It's materializing the fact that they mattered. And there's something about that materialization, it's to, instead of letting the loss sort of recede into the distance, there's something about calling it forward. And, it's reminding me of just a story that I encountered a number of years ago. And it was this Buddhist parable. And it was about this woman named Gotami. And Gotami had lost her child. And, almost like an elephant, carried around the child everywhere she went and was so bereaved. And, the bereavement transforms you at the level of your DNA. You are never the same. You are never the same. And your orientation toward life is never the same, And what happens is the Buddha says, she wants her child to live. And, the Buddha says, go to different people's houses. And if you can find someone who has not experienced loss, then bring me a certain kind of seed.
Bring what?
A certain type of seed, some type of seed. And so she goes on this, going from house to house, knocking on doors, and then comes back transformed because everyone is touched by loss. And so there's something too about this film that holds open space for grief, that speaks and resonates far beyond its particulars, I will ask another question too. Oh, I think there's another question that there are a number of other questions. One was about working with your sister and if it transformed your approach to the story, what the nature of your collaboration was. And then,
this really funny story to tell because my sister Roselle, who was doing the interviews, we were in the boat with Henny, and that boat was a pretty intense ride. I didn't know that, the bay extended all the way, past, Sacramento. It's so deep, the Bay Area, that bay. And there was this seal that was following us on the boat that looked like a long-haired woman, so the whole time we were freaking out. But at the same time, we didn't want to be disrespectful to Henny either, but it was just the scary thing that was happening. And then Roselle was kind of just falling apart, like her glasses broke, her shoes broke, and just the intensity of the filmmaking. She was like, filmmaking so hard as a sociologist, and we were running to the airport. She forgot her bag, her wallet in my car. She got into the airport through the clear, and then she called me. I don't have anything with me, and except they had a ton of lumpia and all this Filipino food that they brought through TSA. So we had a really good time while we were shooting. She's a vegan, so we had a vegan Filipino food craft service everywhere we went. Chicago, the different parts of the Bay Area. It was always, just the challenge of finding the vegan food. I had an amazing crew of 10 San Francisco State cinema students, who were acting as, key creative personnel. And we had lunch every week, just really obsessively talking about this. And it was one of our lunches, I think right before Don Mabalan died, that we had processed her interviews and we were writing all of the things that they just loved about her, as a there's a Tagalog word, kalog, just super hilarious, just powerful figure. And so that's what we were calling her. And then, that afternoon we found out that she had died, and, you make a community, while you're filmmaking, and I've worked with so many people, over the years in ways that still continue. Like we have this mind meld creativity, like working with Theo Gonzalez, who's, an Asian Americanist and a musician, both, like me, like filmmaker, film scholar,
and former head of AAAS.
That's right. And so there's ways that he understands what we're doing, what the songs should sound like, what the music, should sound like. And it's very based in Asian American studies and Asian American historical, like cultural production, like for a long time, I think in all of our movies, we were making different versions of the classic Filipino song Dahil Sa'yo, so we were just doing that through all of the different films, and now we're moving elsewhere. So, I think working with Rochelle was just really wonderful because, she's a fantastic interviewer. She would ask things like, what do you eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? What were your birthdays like? So these just really incisive questions that just generated the most specific, kinds of answers. And it was
right, like asking the question, not even what did you have for breakfast today, but asking like the question, like, what did you eat, after you lost your, like that is, instead of saying like, what was it like for you after your mother,
right.
you lost your mother, it's like, what did you eat?
Right.
Yeah.
And, for film students out there, like coverage, like as I think that's probably one of the most important things you learn in film school is how do you occupy a space? How do you render a space? And you have to be in the space, like just the footage of, the peacock, the footage of the water, the footage of, just the unspeaking, moments that you really have to get, while you're in there, while the people are in there, so that you capture, the space, in the film. And, really the best part is when, it's so hard to talk about as a filmmaker, as a film scholar, what you're doing as a filmmaker, which is why this is some of the best encounters, right? When you're in a room of other scholars and they, interpret the film in ways that you don't even realize is, happening. You have different kinds of intentions, but, they're read in different ways. That's just so rewarding.
There's something about your body of work, which is so interesting, both on the scholarly side as well as on the arts practitioner side, the filmmaking side. And, in critical race and ethnic studies with people like Misha Cardenas and people like Carlton Hester in your division, as well as people like Ronaldo Wilson and in humanities, like there has been this very interesting discussion percolating about how do we understand sort of critical research anew? How do we unfetter it from disciplinary conventions? Like really a lot of those like disciplinary conventions are precisely like the inheritance of a kind of Eurocentric educational model, right? And so how do you get creative in the critical, and how do you get critical in the creative? And I feel as though your work does that on both sides. And
there are things that have to be films, and there are things that have to be books or articles, and you have to approach them with curiosity and I think a great sense of fear, like the next film. So since I just actually finished the last film, I'm in the beginnings of the next film, and I always
tell us about it. Yeah.
So I always start talking about it right as the other film is finishing. I remember meeting with Lucia and Tutsi and showing them the final cut of the film. And then the next day meeting with my next film subjects to get their permission to embark on that next project, which is about, Japanese American family incarceration and racial inheritance, and how people are still continuing to grapple with the meaning of that experience. What is their legacy? What do they inherit? What do they pay attention to? And how that's just really ongoing, right? But this next project, I'm really scared of it, which is, in some ways, it's kind of like my first book, The Hypersexuality of Race, because I think, as I'm occupying this leadership role, I'm really keenly aware of, the way in which Asian American women are really not seen as leaders, and, and they're really quite seen as, just these very, just a sexual proclivity that's naturalized as, performing particular sexual acts, that are really more extreme, than others, And I think after Atlanta, there was just this huge, like explosion of articles, testimonies written by, Asian American women from all walks of life that really chronicle this intense sexualization that they've experienced as they're growing up and growing into their leadership roles. I think I'm going there. I think this is going to be a documentary about that experience. And so far it's been pretty intense, like just speaking with super high-powered Asian American women and how, even as they approach like their most, privileged, powerful positions,
right,
that comes to be a time where those projections of sexualization, the harms that they've experienced really bubble up, So it's going to be an interesting balance. Like, how do you talk about that perversion without magnifying it and naturalizing it? Like when it comes out of the mouth, when you say certain things that are intensely sexual, then it becomes attributed to you. It's a lot of what, Sarah Ahmed talks about, right? But anyway, I'm in the beginning processes of that. But I think it's going to happen. I'm going to make it happen. And right now I'm finishing the next book. I'm going to finish it in September. Yeah.
That's amazing.
I mean, that book is really related to imagining what Lacoste would be like. Like he's turning 17 this year. He died when he was 8, So I'm really trying to figure out like, how do adolescents think? How do people at this age think? Like, what did he understand when he was 8? How would he be as a young adult? How would he experience the world? So I'm looking at films from all of those different ages, in relationship to their parents, their community, and grief.
Yeah. Celine, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your work with us. It has been just deeply moving to engage with your work and, also moving to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much.
It's such an honor and such a pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here. You know where to find me if you want to talk with me more. Thanks.
All right.
Bye-bye.